Hi, everyone. Welcome to our welcome to our lunch and learn series for 2023. Hi, Deborah. Nice to see you. So today, for our inaugural 2023 talk, we have Dr. Deborah Dutta, and the presentation title is Rethinking Environmental Education. Enabling sustainability transitions through community-based urban farming initiatives. And Dr. Dutta is a senior research fellow at the Institute of Rural Management, Anand, Gujarat, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. She's a learning scientist, science educator, environmental educator working in the field of sustainability transition. Before starting her PhD, she also had an engineering degree, has volunteered at NGO to teach underprivileged children, worked as a content developer for a children's magazine. She did her dissertation with the Learning Sciences Research Group at the Homi Bhabha Center for Science Education. Her doctoral thesis is titled Doing to Be, Developing Pro-Environmental Motivations Through Urban Farming in Schools. And it focused on developing community practice-based interventions, such as urban farming, to motivate environment-oriented behavior, right? So this action-oriented approach seeks to address the limitations of just an information-based environment education approaches, which are pretty prevalent. And have failed to sort of motivate sustainable practices among students. So she takes an approach that's inspired by embodied cognition models to study specific farming actions and how they coalesce together to form motivation and values, which then seed wider environment-oriented action in the world. And she also explored the teacher's role in this and their identity in supporting such work, and learning how the boundaries created by disciplines, like disciplinary affiliations, impact their perceptions and teaching. She regularly blogs and tweets on topics related to sustainability, cognition, and education. She's a member of the South Asian Learning Sciences Collective and PR on a project under Transforming Education for Sustainable Futures, a research network supported by the UK Global Challenging Research Fund. She's an avid gardener and enjoys cooking and painting, and I think something to do with wine as well, for my snooping around the interwebs. It is really my honor and great pleasure to introduce her, and we're all delighted that you can join us, and very much looking forward to learning from you today. So thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really a great introduction. You pretty much summarized the talk as well. Good afternoon, everyone. And I'm so glad to be here. I mean, unfortunately, I couldn't make it in person, but hopefully I will some point soon. Thank you for inviting me to this wonderful series. And I'll just share my screen so that I can jump right in. I hope this is visible on full screen, yeah? Okay, so so today I'll mostly be talking about my work and doctoral work primarily, and the title for the talk is Rethinking Environmental Education, and how my work basically tried to understand what are the factors that can enable sustainable transitions through different kind of initiatives, wherein I focused more on food systems through urban farming. So just to give a bit about my background, I mean, my journey as a researcher, educator, and activist, mostly started through a lot of discontentment, wherein my suspicions and disenchantment with mainstream educational approaches and my interest in ecological issues grew almost simultaneously. And even as an undergrad and later on when I was taking up these different work opportunities. I was finding it difficult to reconcile the gaps between everyday realities of pretty much a disintegrating, ecosystem, and the ways in which the education system almost seems to bolster social material aspirations, which are just not in sync with what is going on. So in an effort to kind of understand alternatives, I began exploring different kinds of initiatives, communities, and people where they had been thriving based on values of care, stewardship, responsibility, and reciprocity. So in this way, I kind of visited many sites in India. For instance, on the right-hand side, you can see where I had spent some time trying to understand basics of agroecology from a person who has been conserving more than 1,500 rice varieties, and what was the kind of knowledge, what was the kind of impact, and how were farmers learning from him, and so on and so forth. And I was trying to understand, okay, well, how can these values in some sense make it to the mainstream, educational aims. So, so the structure of my talk today was basically based on the premise that there is a need for motivating ecological perspectives and actions which are embedded in reciprocal and respectful relationships. However, there are no clear models for understanding and nurturing ecologically oriented motivation, because most of the conventional models predominantly rely on information processing theories. So I wanted to kind of explore a different model which takes into account the environment much more seriously. So for this, I did two studies, wherein one was the characterization of a urban community farm. And the next part of the study was where I designed an intervention at a school terrace farm. Based on these two studies, I proposed what we call a dynamic model of motivation. So just to scope my study, I mean, the broad question that I've been dealing with is how can education equip students to effectively respond to environmental challenges? And this is what is usually termed as a wicked problem, because there are no clear solutions or really ways to define what constitute these different responses. So in terms of promoting what one can call as pro-environmental action competency, which is basically the skills, the intention, and the planning that is required to achieve a specific environmental outcome, I wanted to understand if it is possible to build a model of environmental motivations, and then secondly, facilitate interventions based on this model. So coming back to the premise, we know that, let's say, promoting, motivating pro-environmental actions is the core aim of environmental education. However, many dominant forms of education, especially pertaining to environmental literature, have mostly emphasized conveying information related to environmental issues. And there's a reason for it, because mostly the understanding, the assumption is that providing the right kind of information would result in desired action. And this is based on a classical information processing model of cognition. However, since then, it has been widely accepted and known that the knowledge action connection is not a linear connection, and there are many factors that affect what kind of action one would take, even if the knowledge is provided. So when it comes to the pedagogical approaches, what has happened is that the standard modes of such knowledge acquisition have not led directly to the pro-environmental actions or perspectives that one would hope for. And more so, these information-centered approaches marginalize form of knowing that are implicit, experiential, or context-based. Further, the interplay of affect, motivation, social structures, and knowledge is also missing. So in terms of my study, I wanted to understand how can we characterize existing initiatives, for which I have studied an existing practice and tried to articulate the emergence of actions and motivation. And then secondly, to design, I use the findings from the first study to implement an intervention using similar initiatives at the school level. So the broad process was where I did the case study of an urban farming group. I identified certain practices and artifacts and used it to design an intervention of a terrace farming project in a school, wherein I identify different episodes, try to understand students' responses, teachers, as well as those of parents. So in terms of the design, the major considerations that I had was I wanted to look at urban farming as a model system to study environmental actions and motivation. I employed a case study methodology, and my data collection was as a participant observer. Now, my interest in food systems particularly, comes from the fact that food is a very powerful instantiation of different interrelationships, because it is able to capture a range of issues involving human and more than human communities in terms of either where does food come from, what is in season, what goes into it in terms of resources, what happens to it in terms of waste, and so on. So it is a pressing socio-environmental issue because there are food security and sovereignty versus the fossil fuel driven and highly polluting industrial agricultural methods. The effects are well known, and agriculture today is the largest polluter in terms of the sheer percentage. And interestingly enough, farming has also been a core component of many successful community-based interventions that have led to larger political movements and so on. Within urban spaces, I also thought of it as an interesting socio-ecological system, as it would allow for development of an understanding of these different interconnections through food and how it is mediated in an urban environment. So in terms of the questions, the sub-questions that I was dealing with in the first study was like, what are the key elements of practice that lead to pro-environmental motivation? And what roles do different practices play in constructing environmental perspectives? So this was an exploratory case study where I volunteered with the group as a participant observer for over a year. I volunteered for many years after, but the study was like for the first year, where I wanted to develop a nuanced understanding of the urban farming practice and develop better rapport with the volunteers to be seen as a legitimate member. In terms of data collection, there were extensive field notes, conversation logs, interviews, and photos. And the analytical framework was inspired from the situated and embodied interactions and thematic analysis for characterization of the practice and artifacts used at the site. The coding was done with a co-researcher, multiple viewpoints were sought, and practical implications were suggested. So just a bit on the analytical framework. So this approach was inspired from situated and embodied perspectives on cognition, where basically the idea is that the thoughts as a function of interaction with the environment are taken seriously because artifacts constitute the thinking process. That is the argument. And the assertion is that problem solving is carried out in conjunction with the environment, wherein the environment plays a fundamental role in the way one is able to constitute either the problem or the solution and so on. So I wanted to extend this argument and follow a similar trajectory for motivational processes to be understood as arising from salient interactions with the environment. So in terms of the setting, this was a community volunteer farm located in Mumbai in India. And this was Hutchins' famous book of Cognition in the Wild. It was basically a study of trying to understand motivation in the wild, but there was no control over the development or direction of the community practice. Neither there were any prior assumptions. I developed case studies of 5 volunteers over a year, and based on field notes, several observations, interviews. And basically, these volunteers were probed to understand how they relate to the farm, the history of the plants and related artifacts, what they grow, harvest, and if and how they extend their skills to larger issues around them in their community. So just to illustrate a few practice. So one, for instance, major activity at the farm was that of making a nutrient-rich soil. And in Hindi, they call it as Amrit Mitti. Basically, it was a 3-month process where they would engage in collecting a lot of dry leaves to make compost. They would use they would make a slurry of dung to help in the composition process, which would lead to, discussion about the source of the dung, which would be related to the health of the livestock. And the process again involved, mulching, a series of mulching the plants, which was again a question about what kind of diversity is there at the farm level, and how the soil itself, not just above the soil diversity, but below the soil diversity, because they would see all these fungal threads and the critters that would emerge after a few months, as well as look at the root structures and look at the way these leguminous crops would fare better, and they would actually help other crops also grow better. But the interesting thing is that the terms being used here in terms of either the microorganisms or carbon sequestration, soil biodiversity, these were not articulated as formal terms. I mean, as they were making this kind of a nutrient-rich soil over and over again over these few months, it would be like this really major activity. There was this implicit understanding of, oh, I mean, I need to get good quality cow dung slurry. Oh, I need to check the soil to see if, those white threads are forming. We should be able to, the root length or the health of the roots would be an indication of whether the soil was really fertile or not. So there were all these proxy feedback that they would get, which was kind of helping them tacitly make these connections between these different aspects of what actually constitutes soil and plant health. I mean, interestingly enough, one of the observations here was that we had newer volunteers and we had more experienced volunteers. So when something would happen, I mean, if a plant was looking sickly or, the newer volunteers would just would focus on the plant itself because the plant was looking sickly, right? And I would say the experienced volunteers, the first reaction would be to dig their fingers in the soil, because for them it was like, if there's something wrong with the soil, that is what has been reflected in the plant. So for them, soil health became a primary indicator of what was happening in terms of plant health. So some of the recurring themes was that, interestingly enough, it was not that people who were already very ecologically or environmentally oriented, or they were like food activists who had joined as volunteers. Many of them had joined for very, very mundane reasons, as if, because this used to happen on the weekends. I mean, instead of going to a gym, this was like a better way to maybe just do some physical exercise. So there were like these diverse motivations, not necessarily linked to the environment per se, but what was happening is that these community interactions became important avenues for learning. So someone saying that, okay, there's so much to learn about harvesting. I didn't know that harvesting itself had so much thought going behind it in terms of what to take, what to leave. And there was a lot of joy and ownership that developed along with their own perceived competence of tasks on the farm. So for instance, one of them saying that, okay, now, I have been saving my own seeds, and this is something that I can grow in the next season. And that was a source of pride for the volunteers. And that kind of these activities together leading to a certain larger perspectives developing. So someone saying, for instance, that it is not just about growing, it's about harvesting everything that nature has to give, including water. So the other interesting thing we found in terms of the materials themselves, where was this idea of what we termed as performative substances, which seem to embed a certain stance towards nature, because working with these allowed volunteers to embody or internalize these perspectives in a non-descriptive manner. In this case, it being the idea of having native seeds, open pollinated seeds, as opposed to hybrid seeds, or using compost. And there were these ideas that, okay, I mean, frugality or reusability being integrated within the use of these artifacts itself. And by coagulative practices, we meant a set of actions that were generating an understanding of the interdependence of the elements in the environment, such as the symbiotic relationship of livestock and a farm, the need for biodiversity, and this kind of coagulation leading to otherwise probably hazy ideas becoming more substantive and actionable, because they were able to actually bring it together in a as a coherent kind of a task for themselves. So in terms of motivation, what we saw that there was a lot of, for instance, interest in planning ahead in terms of seed saving, designing the farm to increase harvest. There were concerns wider than just the growth of the plants, because for instance, they would see that the space, I mean, they would try to reduce the plastic. I mean, even when they were, for instance, collecting dung, they would see plastic strands in the dung, which indicated that probably the livestock had been consuming plastic, and trying to figure out if there were ways in which they could reduce that, or making plant-based cleaners to reduce chemical usage, because for them it became important as to what is the water source, and if we are adding chemicals to the water source, and it is ultimately going into what we are eating. So these again were connections that were becoming more explicit. Many of them were also practicing different things away from the farm site, such as growing again edible plants at their own home, making compost at their own home. So this for us was a significant marker, because it indicates a persistence to engage in actions in a different context. And the other two examples can be considered as actions activated in response to the evolution of the environment. So integrating these findings, what we see is that there is this a dynamic kind of interaction between the community practice, individual action, and motivation, where the interaction with the plants themselves, and this is a term that I borrow from Tomasello's work to describe the cumulative effects of learning. So here, I was using it to describe how experiences with the plants can act as a ratchet to possibly increase the sphere of actions. And that led to a certain kind of competency, a perceived competency. So when they are like regularly involved in growing the plants, monitoring the health, collecting the harvest, saving the seeds. So there is this idea of, okay, I mean, these are the kind of things I know how to do and what is required to ensure that I do it well. That leading to a certain sense of ownership and agency regarding the space and the actions. And also an expansion of personal context, because for instance, when they realize that, there is so much of these dried leaves required to make compost. Normally in winter, at least in Mumbai, a lot of these leaves are just burnt near at different corners. And that led them to actually start a campaign called Clean Air Campaign, to dissuade people from burning leaves. And they went around in the collection drives to collect And so this was never part of the original, idea. I mean, this is something that developed when these connections became important for them, and they were tying their own sense of personal well-being to these, larger issues. So just to summarize, so in terms of the key elements of practice, we argue that performative substances and coagulative practices can scaffold actions and motivation. And these elements of practice, extended actions, and community feedback can come together to generate environmental perspectives. So based on this, I wanted to also design a school intervention to see how this can be extended to an educational setting. So in terms of the school intervention, I wanted to introduce elements that embed the practice action motivation loop described earlier. And the different elements that we introduced was like making this kind of nutrient-rich soil, using local seeds, making planters, and so on, and making organic their own, solutions for improving plant health. And there were these different practices associated with these artifacts, and there were these certain perspectives which were embedded by virtue of engaging with these elements. This is the school site. And as you can see that this was the terrace of the school. It was completely bare earlier. In fact, it used to be locked and students were not allowed to go up, but we could manage to convince the principal to allow us to use this place. And in fact, if you can see the background, there is a landfill that's like barely a kilometer away from the school. And that itself acted as a very stark kind of contrast to the different possibilities of waste because we were actively composting, and for them it was like, okay, I mean, there is organic waste which ends up there, and then there is this waste which is being used to actually grow things. So to understand again, I mean, the motivational processes involved, the questions that we had were like, how do elements of community practice of farming contribute to student emotions and motivation? And how do elements of these practice contribute to their developing environmental perspectives and actions reflecting what can be called as relational thinking? And if there are any observable changes in students' actions and dispositions away from the site of intervention. So this space, I worked with about 40 students for over 10 months, and we used to work in, I mean, they would work in groups of 2 or 3. This was an ungraded project and was co-conducted with 2 expert facilitators, teachers, and school gardeners. So there were these questionnaires that we administered before and after, and also tried to, we also did in-depth interviews with over 14 students, parents, and teachers, and they used to write their farm diaries, and we had these detailed field notes and videos for analysis. So again, here we saw that, similar to the previous case, I mean, it was not like, again, many students were initially interested in the activity itself. Just the idea of being able to access a space which was not available to them earlier was exciting, or the idea that they would not have to sit in a class, revising homework, and they could actually do something different. There was a novelty to it. So those were the kind of things that seemed to have attracted the students earlier. In fact, many of them like coming to the space, but explicitly it's told that we won't touch the compost, it's dirty, so we'll watch. So we had given them the freedom to kind of take up whatever task they felt, or many of them in the initial 2-3 sessions would not do anything. They would just see some of the other students who just liked placing their hands in the mud and the compost and so on. But slowly there were these different activities that kind of caught their attention. And later, when they actually were able to see like the first sapling come up, or were able to successfully create a support or a planter, that became again exciting aspects for them. And being able to actually again uh, get consistent feedback for their actions in terms of how much they were able to compost, how much of it actually went into growing the plants. So many of them, for instance, talked about how they had started recycling more, or how they had started thinking about food waste much more seriously through their activities. In terms of actions away from the farm side, it was interesting to hear the conversations that they had with their parents, for instance. So, one student here was saying that I told my mom not to throw any cardboard in the garbage. First, she did not listen, she ignored it. But then I told her that you should not, because I wanted to make planters. So then, so how they convinced their parents to not throw something, and they were able to bring it to school. Some of their houses and flats, had a direct, they could view the terrace from their, let's say, balcony. And so this boy is telling that, I could see the farm from my house. So I've showed it to my dad. We zoom in and we are actually taking pictures. Now I water the plants at home because I want to see them grow like they're growing here. So that becoming again a kind of point for them to be able to compare and see what they can do at their home based on what is happening in the school. What was also interesting were these, sense-based interactions, where students' engagement with the plants were in this very rich, visceral manner, and they were very interested in touching, smelling, tasting, and that seemed to widen their experience of the environment. In fact, one of the students, this was an interesting comment where they said that, we have never touched plants this way. We play on the grass, but not this way, to take care. This time we learned how to grow the plant. Otherwise, it is said that just drop a seed and the plant will grow. The book says that. So, he was almost like angry at the biology book, because like they don't say how difficult it is to grow a plant. They just say that you put the seed in the soil and the plant will grow. So students bring so their connection with the plants was also different, because we deliberately avoided, let's say, giving them scientific names or just giving them a lot of information unless they asked for it. So they had developed their own nomenclature of identifying plants, and they would call it like, oh, this one has waxy leaves, this one has thick leaves, this one has a minty taste, this one has a sour taste, sharp leaves, and so on. So they had their own, and then they would ask based on their experiences. So this is a small clip.
Already open, right? Take a look at this. कैसा लगता है?
Yeah, so sorry, part of it was in Hindi, but I guess you can just get the gist of it, where you can see how they're observing and how they're trying to see what is growing on it, what is wrong with it. So for instance, this was a plant in the upper right hand corner. It's Indian roselle, and its leaves taste sour. They had grown very fond of the plant. They had never actually plucked something and eaten it directly. When they found the leaves were edible, they would like almost behave like goats because they would just wanted to taste the leaves as soon as they had come. And when that got infected, so that was like a cause of a lot of concern for them. Suddenly they wanted to read up everything possible on aphids and ants, and what were these ants doing. So that was like one entire event for them, and they were wanted to know how they can save that plant, what they should do, and so on. So it's not like they had not seen infected plants earlier, or that they have not seen ants earlier, but the idea that these mundane observations turn into significant emotional experiences because of the way these everyday events are situated within the farming experience, or the fact that during monsoon overnight they would see these mushrooms and snails pop up everywhere. So in fact, Bennett uses this term enchantment to describe how such affectual moments are important, and she argues that such encounters can be critical in seeding empathy and generosity towards a more than human world. So for us, it was interesting to again see how the students were able to pull in parents into the practices, and from passive spectators, some of them were able to actively support, and the intergenerational influence was seen at two levels, because the parents were probably people who had grown up in the city. The students were second generation students in the cities, but the grandparents had a lot of knowledge about growing plants, because again, growing edible food has been part of, in fact, many communities for a long time. So students were able to have very interesting conversations with their grandparents, and for once they were like, okay, it's usually we are at the receiving end of all the new information with all these gadgets, but now they were coming and asking us about how to grow this, is this edible? And that's where they felt very excited about their knowledge suddenly being seen in a different light. So in fact, one of the students here was like commenting that, my grandmother used to talk about it, but then I was not very interested. So when she came to know that this is happening in our school, she got, so hyped. She did not tell me. She went to the nursery. She bought all these saplings. So now we are growing different things. Another parent commented that, we are planning to make a small vertical type planter because he's so keen on this activity now, and we want to support his passion. So just to generalize, what we argue is that these affective experiences contribute to a feedback loop, wherein these different community interactions are based on these sense-based experiences, which are helping in directing attention and lead to these moments of enchantment to further nurture empathy and manifest more newer community interaction. So it's a feedback loop wherein the more they're able to attend to their immediate environment, the more things they're able to see, the more things they're able to think about. So kind of going back to our previous model, we wanted to expand it, and we talk about how these actions are able to generate care-based interactions, and these are based on empathetic qualities arising from sense-based experiences, and the act of caring promotes the well-being of the cared for. So in this case, for us, it was really seeing that aspect of care emerge between the students and the farm space. So again, just to summarize, what we see is there are these elements of practice nurturing sense-based encounters and instances of enchantment, and sustained engagement with these performative substances and practices, along with these new affective states, seem to expand students' action space and ways of relating with the immediate environment. And most students engaged in diverse activities away from the farm site, which in turn was supported through these instances of joint actions with the elders in the community. So bringing it together, what we are basically saying is that the feedback and competency in community-based practices motivate individuals' sphere of actions. Effective experiences help develop care-based relationships with the environment and extend actions into wider spaces. Engagement with performative substances and related coagulative practices can help generate pro-environmental narratives. And intergenerational shared actions are promoted by embodied experiences and affective states. So, largely I see my work as sort of contributing to, bigger challenges which are besetting educators everywhere, and that is the task of educating for a multi-species world on a burning planet. And I'm hoping that this work kind of also helps us build newer solidarities to ask questions such as how can education respond to the urgent need to restructure human nature relationships in the face of disintegrating socio-ecological systems? How can educators create avenues for transformative sense making beyond frameworks of fatalistic penitence and guilt, which also obscures questions of environmental justice? And in the field of learning sciences, how to legitimize frameworks that recognize relational epistemologies that affirm the interdependence of human and more than human environments. So I'll just end with a call to what is called Break the Dam by Derek Jensen, where he says that, when dams were erected in Colombia, salmons battered themselves against the concrete trying to return home. I expect no less from us. We too must hurl ourselves against and through the literal and metaphorical concrete that contains and constrains us, that keeps us from talking about what is most important to us, and that keeps us from living the way our bones know we can, that bars us from our home. It only takes one person to bring down a dam. So my hope is that each of us can contribute to some small crack, and I'm happy to look at collaborations and ways in which we can do that together. Thank you.
Any questions? If folks online have a question, then let us know. That's what.
I think we have.
I have a question. Okay, sorry.
That's right. I'm just interested in finding out a little bit about how you came to design the specific activities. Like, did the students come to the idea of building organic matter and soil health, or was that part of what you introduced to the school and the community farm, the community garden setting? Like, what, because there are a lot of things that are happening in the community garden. So obviously,
Right.
One of many things, but how did you settle on this particular intervention?
Yeah, you mean within the farming setting, like how did we decide on these different activities?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so some of these activities were drawn from the experiences and interviews I had with the community farm that I interacted with before, where, based on discussions with them, what I'd highlighted as them being salient artifacts, which seemed like particularly core activities. In this case, that was of, making compost or being able to use these open pollinated seeds and so on. So, we had these 3-4 core activities, but again, what was developed in the school was based on, one was like we wanted to keep it very low budget, for instance. We did not have we did not want to invest a lot of funds in setting up the space itself. So it was that, okay, I mean, there is all this waste being generated from the kitchen canteen, and, there is all this, leaf matter that they can collect. I mean, or this question of making planters, for instance. I mean, so the idea of, getting these cardboard boxes or materials, they were was kind of discussed with the teachers and the students, and they came up them with ideas of, okay, how can we create these low cost planters, or how can we create these supports from using existing resources. So there were these initial, I would say, seed of ideas, but how to implement them, or what actual materials to use was discussed, was kind of decided with the teachers and students together. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Hi, Deborah. Wonderful talk. Thank you so much. This is so interesting and inspiring. I'm curious to know, so were there any sort of, so you talked about the wicked problem at the larger level, right? With the socio-political environmental concerns. And India has a rich history of farming being related to the socio-political movements and so on. So I was wondering whether there were some of those discussions, that some of those ideas that, like, urban socio-political things that students brought into the space, or they sort of engaged in any sort of dialogue about like the larger level issues.
Yeah. So this activity, I mean, this entire thing was happening with 8th graders. So it's and for them, the first part was just the novelty of the entire exercise, because they had never, most of them had not grown anything that is edible. And when they started doing that, I mean, questions of labor came in, questions of the fact that how much food travels kind of cropped in. So in fact, and they were again very pegged to individual incidents. For instance, like they harvested some tomatoes sometime, and then they were so proud, and they were so happy with the harvest. So one of them just quipped that, okay, I would sell it for like 200 rupees or something, for like these 5, because there's so much effort we have put, like 4 months or 3 months or whatever. And then the facilitator just asked them, but how much do tomatoes cost in the market? And then they actually came back the next day, and they were like, it just costs like 20 rupees or something. So how much does the farmer get, for instance? So these are like, these came up through their they were not premeditated in that sense. So it would kind of come up as and when they had a certain moment of reflection, or they had a certain moment of like understanding that, oh, these are things which, like, we spend like 2 hours here, and we think we have done so much work, but then someone else is doing, because this division between manual labor and this what is like red, that is just the intellectual information, that gap was something that I think many of them reflected on. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I really loved all the examples of like that enchantment that students were seeing them actually just like spontaneously kind of attach to all of this. Just one thing I was curious about was if there were, or at least if you saw any students that didn't seem to like end up being affected by that enchantment, and if you did, like what sort of factors you think could be at play, even if it's just a guess or something.
Yeah, like I mentioned, there were students who in fact had an averse, they were averse to touching, let's say, the compost or the critters. And so they said that, okay, we'll just watch. Some of them just naturally took to it, and some of them did not. What was happening over a period of time, at least, was just the sheer, curiosity when they saw someone else having like, they seem to be enjoying it. So they just wanted to kind of, okay, dip their hands and see, like, even in that video, if you like, one of them touched the insect, the other one was like, oh, you shouldn't touch it. I mean, it's dirty, or it's like, it can bite you and things like that. And then someone else telling that, no, it doesn't. I mean, why don't you just look? Why don't you try? And for many of them, I think some turning point was definitely when they saw, the first harvest or the first tangible feedback. I think was important for them to have a certain shift in their perspectives. But again, by the end of it, it's not like everyone had the, I mean, what was interesting for me was to see that there were these, so enchantment, again, I mean, as a, it was not the same kind of trigger for different people. I mean, some of them were looking at the harvest, some of them were just seeing that they could make a support which stood on its own and, see a creeper climb up. I mean, that moment was something that they, felt was really great. So there seem to be these different triggers for different people, and it was just more about, a certain shift in stance where they wouldn't look at the same thing in the same way again. So for me, that was something that was important.
Thank you, thank you.
I had a question. One thing or pushback I see come up sometimes about local gardens is the concern that an overemphasis on local gardens sort of ignores the sort of larger systemic factors or isn't sustainable or things like that. Do you have thoughts about like how your project approach addresses those kinds of concerns?
Yeah, I mean, I think, to say that, okay, this is going to, address like larger systemic issues. I mean, I don't think anyone would want to make that kind of a claim in any sense, but how does one open up to these questions? I mean, this kind of connects to also what I think Sugat was asking, that, were these larger questions coming as part of, coming up within their, the different activities they were engaged in. And the question, I think, is whether, activities like farming can open a generative space to be able to build on for these larger systems. And there is obviously, and that the idea of design here comes in, for instance, because we were focused on, let's say using, frugal approaches, or we were focused on, wanting to introduce organic farming and, not rely on, so these then kind of also embody a certain stance that you have with respect to how you want to grow your plants, and whether one is able to engage students in those kind of discussions, that, okay, why we are, let's say, not using a fertilizer, or why we are not using some commercial pesticide, and why are we using open pollinated seeds. So I think there is a space in terms of then the design of a farm. So I mean, the same kind of farming, let's say, done in a, a very big technological setup, which is the case with most of the big corporations, that completely co-opts the idea of farming. So that's definitely a tension, and that's something, again, that the facilitators and the designers and the educators have to deal with. But the basic point is that there is this space which exists, and there is this potential of being able to actually ask difficult questions through such exercises. Yeah.
Thank you.
Go ahead, you have a question?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
yeah, actually, this is like kind of similar, but I think I'm kind of curious about the relationship between like the really cool like situatedness of like the work that you're doing with the students, like they're touching, like they're building like relationships with the garden, and like the sometimes not as situated like realities of like environmental injustice, right? That like can seem more abstract to some people. And I guess I'm curious about, like, do you sort of see that as like a tension, or do you sort of see this as more of like there's a need for some kind of feeling of situatedness in order to like make sense of like the kind of broader environmental like injustices. I don't know if that question makes sense.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the issue is also that in the current scenario, we are inundated with so much of information, and it's kind of it's not very difficult to get lost in terms. I mean, we can talk about justice, we can talk about, but then the question is justice for whom, at what level? I mean, even in this case, let's say the question is, let's say, about livelihoods. I mean, and these are like students, let's say, who are coming from a relatively middle class society, where someone doing this as a hobby versus someone doing this for as a source of income, and on whose land or whose space this is happening. And in fact, one would also see that many places, if this were actually to be successful, these we see instances where public spaces become more inaccessible if they are actually maintained well, or they're greener, or there are edibles growing there. So there are like so many ways in which the same activity can be appropriated, can actually lead to unintended consequences, and one has to, and I think that's an ongoing tension between any intervention that one plans. And one I think that tension is pretty much a part of one's imagination of possibilities and problems. So, and whenever we're talking about questions of justice, it has to really be I would say needs to be put in like concrete and contextualized. Okay, I mean, what are we talking about when we talk about, when we're asking questions of justice here, or, who is affected, who is impacted? So only when we come down to specifics, I think it starts making sense, and where then we can see, okay, in what ways one can intervene. So.
Sure.
Is there anybody online that has a question?
No. We'll have Dawn as the closer.
Okay, sorry. I just thank you so much for this presentation. Work is very meaningful to me. I run 2 large urban gardens and production sites here at SEBS.
Wow.
And so this is what I want my dissertation to actually be about. So I'm so excited I got to come hear you today. In our country here in the United States, we tend to organize a lot of this work around curriculum that's focused on like nutrition and eating healthy. So the Growing the Food is designed to activate activities around dietary consumption and eating behavior. And then there's sort of now more this bucket of climate change, resilience, and environmentalism. And so my question for you is, are you considering or thinking about expanding the work that you're doing into a curriculum that would be available for more school children across Mumbai? Because this is work that everyone sort of in the NGO world is funding now. And it seems like this would be a fantastic opportunity to bring in some of these justice questions that weren't in this.
Right. Yeah, I mean, actually, we have been working on curating kind of experiences of teachers who have been involved in these initiatives to figure out what are like relevant connections that can be made with the existing syllabus, because I mean, I didn't have time to cover the entire, interactions that I had with teachers. But again, I mean, the issue is that, it doesn't really form an integral part of the science education. The way the science education is imagined, and it's usually relegated to, okay, maybe this is related to biology, let's let the biology teacher take it up. And the question might be, okay, why not social sciences, or why not literature? And how does one actually form meaningful connections wherein teachers are also able to use that space to have these ground important discussions? And for that, we wanted to collaborate with teachers to understand, rather than coming up and saying, okay, this is like one module, and someone go and implement it, because that's just an additional workload for teachers without, I mean, we are talking about sense making for students, and there's the sense making that has to happen for educators as well. So that's something that we are, actually putting together as a bunch of narratives and modules, which teachers can actually use. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a critical question, because we run into the same issue with other topics, including this, where it's like, it doesn't fit, so no, it doesn't. Deborah, thank you for an absolutely amazing talk. I loved it. I think for me, what really resonated at some of the issues around the care and the elders in particular, that was just beautiful to see. I also love the art. Is that yours?
I have given, some of the illustrations were mine, and I've given the sources for others. They're open sources. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. So thank you for sharing this work. It's, I think everyone here learned so much. We're looking forward to seeing more from you in terms of, work publications, sharing these materials.
Thank you so much.
So let's give a big hand. Thank you.
Thank you. And please feel free to contact. I'm happy to share the PDF of the slides and my contact later. Yeah.
And next week, we hope you will join us. I believe we have Mia Shaw, correct? Mia Shaw from Ukraine. Virtual, no? What is she doing? Yeah, I think she's gonna, actually not that far away, but I think able to physically make it. So virtual, another wonderful talk. And we have these talks every single week at noon. They are brilliant. They're all brilliant. You heard a wonderful example of the brilliance today. Please continue coming. And thank you again, Deborah.
Thank you. Thank you so much.